Was a better guarantee of staying.
Yes, absolutely. Sheba, who's going first? Who's going first? Rebecca. All right.
You can use mine, but you won't have to. You don't have passport.
I'm just gonna start the screen sharing once you start, and then I'm gonna go back. Okay. If that makes it. Oh, okay. It's more, but like not immediate.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
Maybe just hold it closer. I just turned it up. Try again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our final plenary of the 2025 AHE conference. We hope that you've had a very productive and stimulating few days. I certainly have. Today, there's a little reminder about what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm Sheba Tejani. I'm senior lecturer in the Department of International Development at King's College London. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here, despite all of the partying last night. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two wonderful speakers for the plenary on expanding the frontiers of extraction and social reproduction. Our speakers are working at the cutting edge of the reproduction of value and life, and they have two wonderful presentations prepared for us. We will start with Rebecca Carson. I'll introduce both of them right now. So Rebecca Carson is a theorist working in Marxism and philosophy and the author of Imminent Externalities, The Reproduction of Life in Capital. This is published with Haymarket Books. She is a tutor at the Royal College of Art, where she teaches critical theory and practice. Rebecca's research interprets Marxist capital from the perspective of reproduction. In doing so, she develops a framework to think the logical co-production of three arenas of exploitation and domination today: social reproduction, ecological degradation, and the expansion of finance capital. Her current research looks at how shifting demography and dependency ratios transform the assertion of capital's inherent tendencies and what this means for the exploitation of socially reproductive labor, from care work and the service industry to wage compression and asset inflation. Lucy Wiel is a lecturer and postgraduate research director in global health and social medicine at King's College London. She has founded and is chair of the Reproduction Research Cluster at King's. Her research focuses on the introduction of new reproductive technologies such as egg freezing and time-lapse embryo selection. She explores how these technologies give insight into broader developments within the IVF sector, including the datafication of reproduction and the financialization of fertility. She has published an open access monograph on egg freezing with New York University Press titled Freezing Fertility, Oocytes, Spiropreservation, and the Gender Politics of Aging. Freezing Fertility has inspired a feature documentary of the same title produced by VPRO Backlight. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, and we'll have both speakers, and then we'll have a Q&A in the last half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheba. This works, yeah, okay. First, I want to say a big thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's also a pleasure to be a part of this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions that we have. So my presentation is titled Vampires and Pensioners, Capital's Aging Circuits. And I'm just going to go into it. Oh, yeah, this slide is fine. I've just got two slides, actually. It's this one, which I'm going to start with these two quotes, and then there's a sort of structure of the presentation. So in the 1920s, critiquing the equilibrium postulates of neoclassical economics, Keynes quibbed that in the long run, we are all dead. Over a decade later, preparing what was to be his major project on the Paris arcades, Walter Benjamin noted the experience of our generation. Capitalism will not die a natural death. Juxtapose these two statements, one a truism noting the finitude of natural life, the other a reflection on the vampire-like interminability of capital's social form, present a contradiction. We will die our natural deaths. Capitalism, it seems, will live on. Today, this obvious contradiction appears acutely for many, if not most, in the most powerful capitalist states. An ever larger proportion of citizens are dying relative to those being born. Capitalist form, however, has shown little sign of releasing its hold on social life. So in this presentation, I want to question how we should approach this contradiction and the problems raised by demographic transformation, asking specifically what they mean for a Marxist account of social reproduction. This entails first comprehending what demographic transformation means for Marxism, addressing its relations to the logical forms and dependencies that underpin any account of surplus values circulation. For those unconvinced of Marxism, the project might seem obscure. Why, you might ask, are we not focused on saying what Marxist theory can say about demographic transition? My answer is that to do so presupposes that we already know how demographic transformation should be theorized in Marxist terms. To me, it's not clear that we do. Accordingly, my presentation will consider the theoretical place of demography within Marxism and the issues that this raises, reflecting a training from the perspective of philosophy. But what you might ask is meant by Marxism. Marxism here amounts to historical materialism taken to correspond to the thought elaborated within the critique of political economy, which is not an economics, but a theory of society, distinct from any prior and indeed succeeding framework in its capacity to eliminate the historical formation of social life. As Paul Maddock Jr. observes, Marx's critique, his scientific revolution, quote, involved not merely a reworking of economic categories, but the construction of another set of concepts, explicitly social and historical ones, unquote. On such categories, it's worth saying that where value is mentioned, this means rarefied abstract labor, and capital means a qualitative relation and coercive social form. So this presentation, I'm going to go through three different pages. The first, I want to explain the formal theoretical premise of a Marxist account of social reproduction through drawing on the concept of imminent externalities that I have expounded elsewhere. This concept names a non-capitalist social form that is both imminently produced by and underpins the compulsions of capital's abstract form. It is reproduced within capitalist society, but follows a different logic than capital's reproduction. I will next show how the two reproductions found in Marx's critique of capital follow two distinct concepts of life. These are the life of the self-movement of capital's abstract forms, which are structured by the demands of profit, and the concrete life of human life in metabolism with nature. And then finally, I want to argue that the appearance of demographic crisis and demographic time bombs are expressions of the fundamental conflict between these two modes of life, reflecting an eliminable contradiction between the life of capital and the life of humanity and nature. This, I contend, is how social reproduction theory should address demographic transformation and changing dependency ratios. A theoretical advance in an area often overlooked by Marxist philosophy, this presentation aims to sharpen the theory of capital's total process by integrating demographic variables into the theory of social reproduction, incorporating overlooked factors from infant care to elder care into an explicitly value theoretical argument. Demography matters for social reproduction and for value theory. Shifts in the fundamental variables of human life change the dependency ratios sustaining social reproduction as it is organized within capitalism, and therefore alter the manner in which capital's inherent tendencies assert themselves. Addressing demographic variables, I will ask, how does demography shift the antagonism between capital's reproduction and social reproduction? And in other words, what does age mean for how value is captured? This question is posed so as to theorize demography's place in capitalism and its circulation better. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the first section of the presentation, which is around the concept of imminent externalities. Capital famously separates social reproduction from production. In doing so, capitalist form does not logically provide for the life-making activities of its human supports. Labor power is reproduced privately and is indirectly mediated by the capitalist class and state. Where capitalism does provide for workers' social reproduction, this can be attributed to political contingencies characteristically reflecting popular pressures and the hard-won gains of social movements whose achievements lack inherent stability within capital's social relations. The instability of this provision is evident when looking to the vicissitudes of social reproduction. To name but a few factors, one could consider the advancing privatization of healthcare, the mobilization of racism as means for the control of labor markets and migration, the non-linear provision of gender-affirming care and reproductive justice, and the ever-changing availability of social security nets and legal protections to uphold the subsistence of human life and nature, as well as the rise and fall of the single household income as a conduit for redistribution. Labor power's reproduction is left to the organization of non-capitalist interpersonal relations. In contrast, that is to highlight the specificity of what a capitalist relation, which is an impersonal relation mediated by values circulation. Interpersonal relations are determined by state and legal forms, which compel forms of labor, kinship, and consumption to ensure that life can be lived. These interpersonal, non-capitalist relations are central to the workings of capitalism and its conditions of reproduction and possibility. These are imminent externalities. This concept, I've argued, enables theory to grasp the non-capitalist life processes that are produced by and necessary for capital's reproduction. This concept, imminent externality, reorients attention to the multiple forms of subjection at play within capital's total process, where interpersonal forms of domination operate alongside the impersonal, mute compulsion of capital's automatic subjectivity and drive towards profit. At the same time, imminent externalities enables analysis to grasp the systematic determination of interpersonal forms of domination within historical development of capital's logic, where the person is a legal category distinct from its human bearer. And so that's just to say that multiple levels of abstraction occurring, and not to say that interpersonal relations of domination aren't forms of other forms of abstraction, which renders possible new subjects, reciprocities, and dependencies. So legal form within capitalism isn't purely capitalist, but it's also not pre-capitalist. Such personal relations do not sit neatly outside capital's real abstractions and the impersonal domination they realize, but neither are they products of a value formalism. They're immanent and external to capital's logic. The argument for this reading of social reproduction is constructed through three interrelated elements that I've previously outlined in my book, Immanent Externalities. The first is that the capitalist mode of production as a historical formation depends on a combination of modes of subjection to reproduce. So this includes both impersonal relations of capital's fetish character and non-capitalist interpersonal relations, where we find racial and gendered hierarchies used to ensure the reproduction of labor power takes place. I argue that the articulation of the proportion of these forms of domination evolve historically in a way that is non-linear, with the financialization of capital reflecting a counterintuitive return to the centrality of interpersonal forms of domination, which is due to the financial appropriation of larger shares of surplus value through legal contracts from debt to rents. The second is that the basis of capitalist reproduction process is constituted by the multiple temporalities of monetary circulation, which involves the circulation of credit money and therefore future constraints on subjects. When capitalist reproduction is understood in this way, it becomes apparent that the site of the central contradiction of capitalism is displaced from the Marxian emphasis on production, wage, labor relations. Although production, wage, labor relations condition the character of capitalism, to assume production as the sole site of capitalist contradiction is a reductive reading of the logic of capital's social relations as a whole. The displaced site of contradiction within capitalist social relations, I argue, ought to be located in the tension between capitalist and non-capitalist elements of capital circulation. The non-capitalist elements are termed immanent externalities, as they are required for formal circulation to take place and provide the basis for capital's reproduction process, which are both produced or shaped by capital and remain other to capital. And so it's just to sort of explain how they're a relational category that's historically specific. Thirdly, attention to the contradiction between capitalist and non-capitalist forms and processes internal to the reproduction process of capital reveals an under-examined contradiction underpinning capital's three volumes. There are two conflictual concepts of life operating in capital's reproduction, one capitalist and the other non-capitalist. This tension between capital's abstract life process, or the movement of value forms towards profit, on the one hand, and human life and nature on the other, begets a contradiction between the possibilities of their respective reproductions. But here we can grasp why capital appears to destroy the biological existence of human life and nature on which it depends. Drawing from this approach, this presentation will argue that demographic transformation takes on the appearance of crisis within capitalist society, owing to the fundamental contradiction between the life of capital and human life and nature, affecting, among other things, dependency ratios, the quality of available labor power, and state policies in health, social securities, and care. This contradiction reshapes and transforms capital's imminently external social relations. Now I'm going to move to the second section of the presentation around two concepts of life that you can find in Marx. Adequately understanding capital's immanent externalities requires comprehension of two distinct yet seldom distinguished concepts of life at work in the critique of political economy: the life of capital on the one hand and human life and nature on the other. The first concept of life, Marx's idea of the life process of capital, is Hegelian in origin. Hegel's concept of life and reproduction underpins a tension between capitalist interiority and exteriority in Marx. Grasping its significance helps us to better understand capital's operations, as Chris Arthur, Patrick Murray, Tony Smith, and others have shown. But doing so also enables us to see the difference between the two concepts of life outlined in Capital. One is used to explain the abstract life process of capital, and the other, the concrete life of humans in metabolic relation with nature. Their difference reflects Marx's different inheritances. The philosophy of life in German idealism and concepts of life derived from the natural sciences burgeoning at the time of Capital's writing. The two are distinct, and the cleavage between the two registers the tension between capitalist and non-capitalist forms, where Capital's abstract forms require non-capitalist forms as its means for reproduction. Capital for Marx is, quote, the free subject with its independent right. However, in Capital, the book, on a technical level, the Hegelian reconciliation of being and essence in the concept only occurs within the movement of Capital's abstractions. And there's no reconciliation between matter and Capital's form. In Capital, matter, whether living or inert, cannot be ontologically understood from the point of view of Hegel's philosophy or Capital's abstract forms. Developed from the Hegelian dialectics of the idea, Capital's life is completely fetishized to elucidate capital and its movement through value forms. And this excludes concrete life. It's only ever life-like. In Capital, concrete life remains in conflict with the seemingly autonomous life of the concept subject capital, producing permanent interruptions and obstacles. This bifurcation occurs because the life process of capital is entirely fetishized and abstract, while the life of those living within capitalist social relations remain concrete. In the dialectically reunified category of living labor, which contains both the abstract and the concrete natural life and the life of capital exist in permanent tension without reconciliation. Therein, the two concepts of life form an antagonism whereby concrete life is completely internal to the realm of social reproduction, or the reproduction of human life in metabolic relation to nature. And hence, for Marx, Hegel's logic primarily operates at the level of an ontology of capital or a logic of abstractions, and does not provide a basis for ontological understandings of human anthropology or the natural world. Due to natural limits, the metabolic process between humans and nature will always remain antagonistic to capital's social forms, but the concrete will also be historically altered. Therefore, close attention to Marx's form analysis ought not to be used merely to grant ontological primacy to capital's abstractions, but should be used to analyze from the perspective of a materialist orientation for understanding what are the precise limits of capital's abstractions and how do they relate to the complexity of materials that constitute the totality of the world. What is other to capital is logically and concretely understood to retain an element in which it reproduces itself for its own sake. This represents an ontological distinction within the logical process of reproduction that permits us to analyze the extent to which the concrete remains independent. Consequently, it is then possible to articulate how this independence can be retained and developed for purposes other than the reproduction of capital. And that's sort of the political charge of that analysis. And so finally, I'm going to move to the last section that is applying this to the question around demographics. The tension between human life and capital's life finds expression in recent concerns framed as demographic time bombs and demographic crises. In these locutions, the finitude of human life appears ill-suited to capital's demands for endlessly available labor power. Capital, it is safe to say, has begun to encounter pressures in the aging and diminution of its supports. Equally, these imminently external relations, beyond the formal logic of surplus values extraction, upholding the reproduction of social life, are transforming in ways that will invariably affect the self-assertion of capital's inherent tendencies. Demographic aging, to put it succinctly, is redirecting flows of value and requiring shifts in exploitation and dispossession of socially reproductive activity. Recent changes in the motion of value reflects capital's aging circuits, transformed by a combination of demographic decline in major capitalist powers, ecological degradation, financialization, and rentierism. The latter two, whilst are developed by different logics, are in some ways symptomatic and intensified by an aging population, which inflates asset prices through hoarding and property and expands interest-bearing capital by enlarging pension funds. The combination of all the above produces a dynamic that logically undermines society's ability to sustain social reproduction in the way that it is or has been, that is in its patterns of daily and generational renewal, through changing dependency ratios, creating a need for proportionately larger amounts of care within a society that does not intrinsically cater to this. The additional stress placed on social reproduction from the complex requirements for elder care, the high costs of raising children, including increased costs of housing, food, childcare, combined with wage compression and dispossession linked to environmental degradation, correspondingly leads to wide-ranging structural barriers to generational renewal. Reflections on demographic change have been few in Marxist theory. Notable exceptions can be found in the work of Wally Succumb and more recently Jason E. Smith's article, After the Wave, Winter, Demographic Decline and the quote-unquote production of men in the 21st century. Gabriel Winant too points to demographic issues in his essay, The Baby in the Bathwater, Class Analysis and Class Formation After Deindustrialization. Despite these interventions, a lacuna persists. Marxism, for the most part, has eschewed reflection on demographic change. The reasons for this, I think, are twofold. The first is that a more contingent motivation reflects Marxist understandable desire to steer clear of the racist tropes repeated within writings preoccupied by demography. The second is tied to the method of the critique of political economy. This history of the relationship between Marxism and demography is, for the most part, a history of denunciation. Marxists have repudiated the faulty logic of Malthusian reason and countered its ideological role in eugenic policy. Much of this has been important and correct intellectual work, but as Succumbe argues, the result has often been an overcorrection of opponents' arguments done to the extent of suppressing the autonomy of demography altogether. From a methodological perspective, Marx also says little of demography within capital, and this is because he famously notes in the Grundrisse that population is an inadequate concept which to begin theorizing society. Population on this account is given it's given as an empty abstraction. To consider population before addressing its component relations would be to proceed from the seemingly concrete to the abstract. Famously, Marx argues that materialism must instead move from the abstract to the concrete if it's going to reproduce reality and thought. Marx's program is to theorize the logic of capital, starting from its most fundamental determinations, which are its value forms. Only after capital has been understood as a historical form and logic, Marx argues, can the significance of demography be reckoned with. Put simply, demography must come after the systematic logic of capital's relations have been outlined. These have been outlined, and Marxist theory therefore ought to venture to a level of abstraction where demography matters, painting a fuller portrait of capitalist society where this obviously significant variable takes effect in the realm of social reproduction. And here there's a manifest tension which Marxism has to grapple. Demographic composition both constitutes the conditions of social reproduction and is ultimately what social reproduction produces and reproduces. Capital places limits on demographic developments, and demographic developments place limits on capitalist production. As Sakambe has argued, quote, there has been an unfortunate counterposition of the socioeconomic to the demographic, as if these two dimensions of social relations were materially separable under capitalism or elsewhere, and if the lines of causality ran undialectically only one way from the socioeconomic and political to the demographic. This must be overcome, and as Sakambe further explains for good feminist reasons, quote, the social control of women is centered upon the control of their reproductive capacities in a vast range of societies. Therefore, paying close attention to the demographic regulators of women's fertility and their change over time is politically significant. Demographic changes affect the vectors of impersonal domination that govern capitalist social form, but they also, and in combination therewith, disproportionately affect the interpersonal relations of domination and dependence women and non-binary people experience. The task, therefore, is to return to Marx's account of capital's circulation, asking what population transition means. But how does capital confront demographic change, particularly demographic decline? Capital, taken in most abstract compulsions, logically encounters demographic decline as an ebbing supply of variable capital. An aging and diminishing population threatens the steady, easily replenishable supply of good quality labor power, further constraining possibilities for the continued existence of a large reserve army of labor. All things being equal, capital is challenged with finding more labor to keep the rate of surplus value extraction high and rising. Countenancing such problems, capital would, in the abstract, push to amend or remove prevailing age-based limits to supply. Given pervasive taboos on child labor, one assumes would entail redoubled efforts to push the upper limits on working age north. Capitalist production would demand workers to work longer into old age. Yet doing so brings with it the social reproductive challenge of managing the capacity to undertake wage labor into old age, not to mention the obvious political conflicts that will be needed to resolve. There are a host of questions to be asked here about how capitalist societies would adapt to heed this compulsion. But what I want to argue is that this simple argument, whilst not wrong, attends only to a very abstract understanding of capital. Capital's motion is not only determined by abstract law-like tendencies of production, but by state, legal, and institutional forms. These do not appear in the most basic articulations of capital's logic and require capitalist circulation to be theorized more fully. With these figured into an account of capital circulation, it becomes clear that at the level of demographic crisis appears the state, the imperative need not be to expand the working age of a given state's population. Migration policies offer a lever with which to acquire requisite quality of variable capital. But viewed from the point of view of capital's total social process and not just production, the state need not heed to the compulsion to maximize surplus value extraction at all. Instead, it can seek to merely appropriate as much surplus value as possible through unproductive distributive struggles. In this regard, the response of the state to constricting flow of available labor power might not only be to expand the supply, attracting migration, and extending individuals' working life. Rather, the state could instead orient itself to other ways of winning a disproportionate share of capital's spoils as compensation. Here, the imperative would be to intensify the distributive struggles that have characterized capital's movement in the last 40 years, turning to monopoly protections, rent-seeking, imperial conquest, and finance. If states cannot acquire labor power, they can seek to take its products. Given present political pressures surrounding migration, themselves rooted in capitalist, imperial, and racially segregating history, and working age, a fiercely defended last bastion of life-spared work discipline, it seems likelier that the more powerful states will pursue redistributive conflicts with even greater vigor. The critical question, to return to the presentation starting point, is how social reproduction will respond to these changes, and how will the imminently external relations of social reproduction in turn exert new pressures on the actions taken by major actors within capital's circulation. This, I think, is a pressing challenge for social reproduction theory. Any adequate response will have to grapple with the complex transformations of profit-driven activity and household labor. In the context of aging populations, significant job growth will tend to occur in the service sector or care work, especially in low-wage personal services. These jobs are difficult to mechanize, and especially when immigration policy is suppressed, as they need to take place locally. Because of this, productivity gains are hard to come by, as accumulating surplus value requires more employees and is therefore susceptible to the limits of demographic change. What does this mean for capital's total social process? How will capitalist and non-capitalist relations change as such developments entrench? Now, just to conclude quickly, examining what demography means for capitalism enables us to see that what is often described as a demographic time bomb or crisis reflects a deeper antagonism between the life of capital and human life and nature. The social miseries produced by demographic shifts, be that in a historic youth bulge, where the maintenance of infants, children, and youth deplete resources, and a large number incurred difficulty entering labor markets, or in an aging population where the maintenance of elders requires support from a shrinking number of workers and overwhelms existing healthcare infrastructure, placing stress on social welfare systems and pensions. These are both an expression of the contradiction between these two forms of life: the vampire-like reproduction of capital, whose structure is homologous to Hegelian dialectic, and the finite natural life, which is not a moment internal to the dialectic of capital, but sits outside it as the disavowed material support for the self-expansion of capital's ideal forms. People die and capital doesn't. The rate at which populations expand and contract transforms the assertion of capital's inherent tendencies. The task that confronts Marxist theory today is to explore the complex ways concrete societies will mutate as a result of this dynamic. Thank you.
I don't have a clicker, but I can do that for the, so should I start? I can do it for you.
It'll be too difficult. Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm going to be standing on this side because I have a lot of movements to make on the screen, so I need to be near the keyboard. Really good to see you all. Welcome, everyone. Welcome especially to the little baby. I think it's so important that we bring our babies to conferences. So all of you who have them or are going to have them, please bring them. And let parents feel welcome, that they can be in these spaces as well. So I would like to talk today, following up from Rebecca's stimulating talk, about eggs and equity, the finance and the future of fertility. So I work here at King's at the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and I run a reproduction research group, and my work deals mostly with assisted reproduction, but also with abortion and contraception. And we look at that from the perspective of science and technology studies, as well as the social sciences more broadly. But given the context of this conference, I'd like to focus on the idea of finance or financialization and how it changes our practices and ideas of fertility today, and also how that engages with the regulation of reproduction from the state. So I'm going to start first with the beginning. The first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978, and she's pictured here with Bob Edwards, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in creating her embryo, which he did together with Patrick Steptoe and Jean Purdy. And we can see that he didn't just create a baby, but he also created Bourne Hall, which is the first IVF clinic in the world near Cambridge. And when we move forward, we see a more recent picture of Bob Edwards and Louise Brown. Bob Edwards is no longer with us, Louise Brown is, but we see that time has passed in their bodies, and time has also passed in the clinic. And what's changed in the clinic a couple of years ago was that it was bought by private equity investors from Canada. And Bourne Hall is not alone in that. We see that private equity plays a big role in the organization of assisted reproduction today more widely. So some of the big ones, such as KKR, are now creating the largest deals in the fertility sector. So the EV-RMA deal was a large one 2 years ago. And as you know, they're among very large firms that have a lot of power. And we see that those biggest ones, Blackstone was interested in a large Indian clinic. KKR was interested in EV-RMA, which is now the largest fertility group in the world, combining Spanish and US fertility clinics into larger groups. And we see that, you know, these are some of the more recent figures that there were a lot of buyouts, and that private equity currently owns about 1/3 of US IVF cycles. And also in the UK, they own the largest groups are owned by owned by private equity. So as you are probably familiar, private equity is the a particular mode of investment in which investors buy up, in this case, clinics, and then they seek to sell them within 3 to 7 years to the next investors, or another way of making an exit with some return on investment. And this has some effects on the IVF sector, because this is really a new thing for IVF. This has only happened really at a larger scale for about a decade. And it has changed how IVF professionals, how medical professionals deal with their work, because previously they functioned more like GPs. They had their own independent practices, and now suddenly they describe these kind of things. So Wendy Lippert, for example, interviewed a few people. They say medical people working in IVF, they said, because now you see someone who's running a business and their duty is to the shareholders and to make sure that the returns of the shareholders for their investment are maximized. Medical professionals describe how the bankers said, we want to grow the business and we're going to sell it again in 3 years' time. So they are describing now having to deal not just with the needs of patients, but also with the needs of investors, and being in conflict at times between the two of them. But before we go into that, just a little recap with what happens with private equity. They buy clinics, they turn them usually into larger groups in order to increase their value, and then they sell them. And they do that in IVF through operational improvement, which basically means that they try to increase revenue by introducing new products, new services, for example, new steps in the IVF cycle, so that you get more revenue per patient. But also by reducing costs. So for example, reducing the labor costs through specialization and automation. Then they seek to increase the multiple values. So that's the valuation of the company based on a multiple of their EBITDA value. And they do so by telling stories about the future and about how they're going to grow in the future. And of course, they also do a buy and build strategy, in the sense that they seek to integrate many companies into a platform companies and benefit from economies of scale by making larger entities. Now, all of this is creating a different kind of financialized fertility. So, as I mentioned, we have the consolidation or the integration of smaller clinics, what they call a fragmented market, into larger groups of IVF clinics that are integrated into often multinational groups. And what I have done is I've spoken to a number of investors, as well as medical directors and embryologists and people working in the field, to ask how they feel about this. And some IVF investors said, oh, it makes a lot of sense, because we can merge bigger clinics with smaller clinics, and that we can export best practices. So suddenly we're raising the quality of care for everyone. That's great. And some people say it's great that we have these investments because then we have more money to develop our clinics and get better quality care. But we also have medical directors who say, you know, if you're owned by private equity, suddenly you have to really focus on showing growth and returning value. And the main purpose of that's really the main purpose of private equity. So they don't want to buy a clinic that makes £1 million per year. They want to make a clinic that, they want to buy a clinic that shows growth so that it goes from, say, from 20 to 25 and so on. And in order to get a good valuation, they want to cut the costs right before the exit. So you have to nip and tuck your clinic to show great growth right before the sale. When I spoke to a Dutch embryologist, they said, you know, of course I know that my colleagues work in private clinics that have been bought by these large fertility companies, and they no longer can choose the treatments or the technologies they use themselves. They have to work with these best practices. They have to work with choices that are made by management, often elsewhere than in the clinic themselves. And a lot of the people working in the field are raising concerns about these developments. They say there's more monopolization, which is a threat to smaller clinics. There are more so-called add-on treatments, so people sell additional treatments in the IVF cycle. And it's also harder to sue clinics for patients because they are dealing with very large entities with a lot of capital. So this is one example of where we see the changes in the IVF cycle. I realize that this may not be an audience that is super familiar with all the add-ons, but one thing is that when you do IVF, you take the eggs out of one body, you get sperm, you fertilize it in vitro. So traditional IVF, you just put the embryo back into the womb. But there's many more things you can do, which all come at a price. And the most expensive one is PGT, that's pre-implantation genetic testing, which is where you take a couple of cells out of the embryo, you genetically test the embryo to check if it's got the right amount of chromosomes. And then you only place the ones back with the right amount of chromosomes because those are more likely to become a healthy child. That sounds like it makes a lot of sense, but there hasn't actually been enough RCT evidence that it actually helps, partly because the embryo can potentially have a lot of different types of cells within its within its cell structure, so that you have maybe some cells that are chromosomally abnormal, but some that are chromosomally normal, so that it can still become a healthy child, even if you have a negative test. There's a big discussion about that. But what is striking is that you see here, for example, that the private equity-owned clinics do a lot more of this genetic testing than the ones that aren't owned by private equity. And in this country, it takes, for example, an extra £3,000 per cycle to add this genetic testing. So there is a conflict of interests between potential undue financial incentives and also a different concentration of power when private equity turns clinics into much larger groups. And what happens with labor, as in many places, is that there is another influence on how people look at labor in the IVF clinic. So one Canadian medical director say, you know, I actually think this investment money is quite positive because they can help us see the inefficiencies in labor. And say, for example, now I am a doctor who sees the patient for 1 hour, but actually a part of that is pretty repetitive. And, you know, a nurse can do that just as well. So if we make the time with the doctor shorter and we have more time with the nurse with patients, we can do this more affordably. So he said, you know, that's quite a good idea. But what also happens is that doctors are increasingly evaluated by the number of cycles they can do each year. So you might see, for example, Gina Bartassi is developing a large group of new clinics called Kind Body. And she says she doesn't really want to hire doctors who do fewer than 1,000 IVF cases a year. And they say, well, it's about a mindset. Some people are very comfortable doing 150 cases, but we want them to be more efficient and do 1,000 cases. So this is becoming a metric on how successful fertility specialists are. One large group in Australia, for example, has an incentive scheme that says, you know, if as a doctor you do more than 300 cycles a year, you get some extra money, you get a bonus, you get some equity in the company and so on. So it's really changing the way in which labor is organized in that way. There's a question, is there a minimum level of care, expertise, and clinical oversight that's required if there's a real drive to increase the number of cycles per doctor. And there's also a question, if these cuts in labor costs, are they going to actually benefit the patients, which is what a lot of people presented us, or is it going to be really a way to benefit the bottom line and improve the exit strategy for investors? Then we have the question of labor that's met with automation. So as in many fields, you see that the idea that automation is going to change everything and is going to make everything more affordable is very popular in IVF. We already have this, for example, where you do the automated incubation of embryos. So embryos don't immediately are returned back into the womb, but after they are fertilized, they stay in an incubator for 3 to 5 days. Now you've got automated ones where you get pictures every day, taken every 5 minutes of the embryo, so you get videos that show which one is most likely to implant. Previously, embryologists would take the embryos out of the incubator every day to look at them under the microscope. These videos are also live streamed to intended parents so they can see their embryos growing while they are at home. So this is one form of automation that already exists, and that makes the experience much faster. But the goal is really to automate the entire embryological process. And for example, natural life is a concept where you would just have a machine where you input egg and sperm and you get a genetically tested embryo out a couple of days later. People say this would be great because it would be much more efficient and I can do it anywhere in the world, even if they don't have great labs, and I don't need all these expensive embryologists. And we see that there's a lot of interest from the tech sector in investing in these kinds of machines. So let me just show you a little promotional video. Right, so you see that that really encompasses that idea that they can democratize things, they can make it affordable if we just invest in the technology and automate it. And we saw among the investors, for example, the people who started 23andMe, people who started YouTube, and some other names that are familiar in Silicon Valley. Now, that machine that we saw there doesn't exist yet. It's a prototype. There's a lot of money being invested in that kind of research, but it's not available yet. But this has been introduced in a clinic in Mexico last year, because in the US you need more FDA approval. So they do, usually they do a lot of innovations in Mexico. And here we see a sort of larger version of this machine where you go from vitrification to sperm selection to ICSI, which is sperm injection in the egg, to incubation and to treatment of the egg, all and the culturing, so that's the incubation, all automated in different connected machines that are treated, that are engaged with by robots that move between these different boxes. So this is the current state of play. And of course, we have more widely beyond embryology, the idea that not assisted reproduction, but artificial intelligence is going to change every aspect of the IVF cycle. And we see that, for example, in one of the new clinics in London, it's called Avenues, and they say we are the only clinic in the world to offer AI-driven technologies through your reproductive journey. So yeah, they do a variety of integration of AI, but they really lead their marketing with it, which I think is interesting as well. So when we talk to these medical directors about the future of assisted reproduction, we see that this focus on automation, AI, and as a result, the demedicalization of assisted reproduction is really seen as the future. They see that maybe big businesses will own these clinics, working more with nurses because they are cheaper, and scaling everything up to get more growth is at the heart of the image that a lot of medical directors have, whether they enjoy that or not. And so there is a question when we look at this automation, whether we need to regulate what happens to the data, whether we need to regulate efficacy and success claims of these new technologies that are often not recognized by the regulators actually helping, and how do you actually regulate the fair pricing? So who pays for the efficiency or who benefits from the efficiency? Then we have the question of marketing. So we saw that there has been a lot of investment, particularly in the idea of egg freezing. So I wrote a book about egg freezing. Egg freezing is basically half a cycle of IVF. So you get the eggs out of the woman, but instead of fertilizing them, you freeze them. So you can fertilize them a couple of years later when it would be harder for her to conceive with her own eggs. And that way you can extend the reproductive timeline of women or anyone with ovaries. This was very attractive to investors because normally IVF is only for people who are wanting to have a child at the moment, who find that they can't, and who are ready to take that step and have the money to do so. Whereas egg freezing, you can basically appeal to any woman who is maybe wanting to have a child in the future, and you don't need any particular clinical problem. So you have a much wider potential patient pool. So the investors were very interested in egg freezing, and that they could reach, in this case, Americans who live in social and digital media, because they could convince them that maybe it may be a good idea to undergo an IVF cycle and freeze some of their eggs. So this one was one of the biggest investors a few years ago. He received the biggest investment, Martin Varsavsky, who made his fortune in real estate and in telecommunications. And he got 200 million investment in his new company, Prelude, and bought up a lot of the existing IVF clinics and became the largest group in the US within 2 years. And what they do with Prelude, but also with many of the other clinics, is that they say, now the average age of egg freezing is around 38, 37, but they said we should really ask the younger crowd to do it, because then we get a much bigger group, and they will also have to pay freezing storage for much longer. So that means that they basically double their investment. But also, it could be more effective biologically to do it earlier. And then the way in which that's marketed is, for example, you'll never be more fertile than you are today, so you better hurry up and freeze your eggs. And so then there's a question. When this marketing receives that much investment, the question is really who provides fertility education? And is there a conflict of interest if that education merges with marketing? And do we over-medicalize our bodies as a result? So as a part of it also raises the question, as we're doing more automation, we're moving into these bigger platforms, there's a lot of marketing, we get a different kind of idea of the clinic, often an online clinic. And one example is Trellis, which was created by an investor who thought egg freezing was a great idea, but they thought women don't really like to go to boring clinics. Let's make a really beautiful clinic, and they can go here. The problem is that the investor lost interest after a couple of years and closed the clinic, leaving a lot of women concerned about their treatment and their eggs. And a similar thing happened in the UK recently. There was a clinic called Apricity, which was an online-only fertility clinic. So you do your tests at home, and they had some partner clinics to do anything that couldn't be done at home, but mostly you would communicate with the partner group. And they raised a lot of money to do a virtual IVF clinic, which looked like this. You can be supported at every stage of the journey, but you can do that from the comfort of your own home. However, this clinic also had some negative decisions from the investors and was closed in January this year. So you see, sadly, they had to cease all operations, leaving a lot of people distraught. So this just shows both the concern about what does a regulator actually regulate, because it becomes unclear what exactly clinic is when these platforms take a really central role, but also what happens if the investors have so much power that they can decide to close clinics at a whim much more easily. Now, one more important thing is that you may have heard of fertility or egg freezing insurance. So a couple of years ago, Google and Facebook started offering their employees the option to freeze their eggs. And there was a lot of concern about that because was that really a measure to say, we don't want you to have children, why don't you freeze your eggs instead? Now, what's happening is that that kind of fertility insurance has become very popular. And we see that one of the largest companies in the fertility sector are not the clinics, but rather the insurers. And one big insurer is here at Progeny. We see here that they had their IPO and joined the NASDAQ. And what they do is not so much discouraging reproduction, but really promoting a different kind of assisted reproduction. They say, if you don't do this, they say to the employers, if you don't offer this kind of insurance to your employees, they're going to make choices that are not in your benefit. They're going to take out loans, they're going to get miscarriages, they're going to get twins because they put in too many embryos because they're trying to save money, and that's going to cost you a lot in NICU costs. It's going to cost you a lot of additional medical costs for your employees. So it's much better to work with us, use our fertility insurance, and make sure that they do a particular type of way of doing IVF with genetic testing, for example, so that they only get one healthy baby and they don't get all these miscarriages. Now, the question of whether that's actually the case is really contentious. So the UK regulator doesn't think adding additional technologies reduces miscarriages and increases the outcomes. But we do see that when you do fertility insurance, for example, through Progeny, they include the sperm injection, they include the genetic testing, they do assisted hatching, is where you create a little hole in the embryo, and of course, the freezing, the vitrification. And beyond that, they also include a very specific patient experience. They don't just reimburse the money, but they also become the main point of contact for the patient or for the employee. And so what's interesting here is that the insurer has much more control now, not just over the money, but also over clinical recommendations, over the auditing of the clinics, and over educating the patients. And it makes you wonder whether the insurer takes on the role of a sort of indirect regulator. So lastly, let's look at the future. So I've been talking a bit about the effects of private equity investment on clinics and to a degree on insurers, but we also have venture capital investment, which is really growing in this field of femtech and fertility more widely. And one area that's going to completely change everything in case it works is in vitro gametogenesis. I don't know if you're familiar with this term already. So with IVF, we take an egg and a sperm out of the body and do the fertilization in vitro fertilization. With in vitro gametogenesis, you create the egg and the sperm from stem cells. So you might take, say, for example, some blood from a man or a woman and turn that into an egg or a sperm. The radical potential is that you could potentially make male eggs or female sperm. You could create children with 4 parents if you create 2 embryos and you take the stem cells from the embryos and make egg and sperms with embryos. So there's a lot of different potentials of creating genetically related parenthood structures. But importantly, it would also go across many of the bottlenecks in assisted reproduction now. You could make new eggs and sperm later in life. You could do that across gender, across age. So yes, it would completely change things. Now, this technology is being developed in Japan, the US, and the Netherlands, and in the UK as well. It has already worked in mice. So we have mice, for example, with 2 genetic fathers, where the genetic stem cells from 2 male mice were turned into eggs and sperm and led to the creation of new individuals that were viable. But it hasn't happened in humans yet. The Clark Lab, as part of UCLA, is trying to do this work and develop and see if that's possible. And they are part of the university, and they are presenting this as something that will give them more insight into developmental biology. And they are funded mostly by the NIH and by the federal government. And we see, of course, a lot of disinvestment from that at the moment. So that's in peril to a degree. And then we see the same research in the same state being done by startups. So one big startup is Conception, which has received its funding from venture capital, as well as from people well known in the tech industry. So this is Sam Altman, who started OpenAI and ChatGPT, and this is Jan Tallinn, who founded Skype. And so These are some of the investors who are interested in developing this technology more and also in influencing how it is presented and how it's marketed. So this has a lot of implications when we look at the future of technology. This is just one case study and just one technology about who is doing this research and how is that research shared. So we see that the startup, for example, doesn't really share its findings in peer-reviewed journal articles. They don't really present that much at academic conferences because they want to retain their intellectual property and not share the information. So the people at the Clark Lab feel really ambivalent, like, should we share our information? Should our students go to conferences or our postdocs? Because maybe the startup people will run away with it and they don't do anything in return. So maybe we should be more careful with our knowledge as well. But it also shows the different kinds of power concentration when we have the investments of those influential people. And we also have again the question, who steers the future of fertility and what kind of financial streams drive it? So all of these different elements show a financialized form of fertility in which we see that it's not just about funding, but it's also about shifting the power relations that shape a sector and all these different elements of scaling up practices, changing labor practices, increasing automation and marketing with potential over-medicalization, organizing care much more through platforms and then integrating through insurance mandates different forms of care within an IVF cycle. And at the same time, we see that both the current practice of fertility, but also the future of fertility is really being reshaped by these financial streams. So I wanted to share that with you and talk about it with you. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. I run a research group on reproduction, and every year we have a big party at the end of the year. I've just done mine in May, but if any of you are working on reproduction and would like to join, it's called the Reproduction Salon. Send me an email and I will invite you next year. It's free, it's on top of Bush House. You have a lot of nice food and drink and always exciting guests to do fun things together, and you can showcase your work. So please come.
Thank you so much. These were two amazing and I would say even slightly alarming presentations. I thought your presentation showed really beautifully the insertion of capitalist relations of production into the most, sorry, I just gave you lunch, into the most intimate spaces of life. Yeah. So follows very nicely from your sort of more theoretical exposition about extending social reproduction theory. So without further ado, let's open up for questions. Angus, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, thanks, but they were amazing presentations. And Lucy, that video for advertising Orbiter is terrifying and the most dystopic thing I've seen in a long time. I wanted to ask something that Rebecca mentioned in a presentation about eugenics. Right. It's a question for both of you, but phrased slightly differently. So Rebecca, given that Ruthie Gilmore defines racism as kind of like the systematic uneven distribution of death, how does the fact that kind of you have these two conceptions of life that are organized slightly different, where does eugenics come in? Because it is kind of a thing that leads on to kind of my question to Lucy about IVF. So one of the things that has emerged through kind of being able to look at the chromosomes, right, is that you can check for things like Down syndrome and decide that you don't want to do that embryo. In the States, apparently you can pick the gender, right? So where does eugenics come in? Particularly because the Silicon investors who are investing in that next phase of technology have been leaning into race science, and eugenics is making a comeback, particularly in these libertarian kind of Silicon Valley circles. So is that a thing? And how does this changing kind of financialized structure of IVF lead? What are the politics of that? And do we need to be talking about eugenics in a way that kind of in a new way in light of both of the presentations today? Thank you.
Questions because we
Quick question. Fertility rates around the globe, particularly in developed nations, are going down, different than birth rates, but a different topic. But I would see on the part of these corporations, they're looking at this and seeing this as a huge opportunity for them down the road to take advantage of the dropping fertility rates. Is that part of their thinking? I would think. And then the other question is, Trump last year campaigned in the United States on being, this is a double entendre, I guess, the father of fertility. But so far, nothing in the United States has happened. I guess he wanted to mandate the insurance companies covering fertility. I guess he's changed his mind. In the United States, we have a crazy health insurance system where some states mandate fertility treatment, others don't. They refuse to make the insurance companies cover it. So are you aware of any lobbying, at least in the United States, where they're trying to get Congress and the president to push this more, which would mean more profits for them, particularly with the declining fertility rates? So
Thank you. Thank you. I would just request everyone, please keep your questions brief and concise. We have only 15 minutes and we want to get as many in as possible. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for those incredible presentations. Chills down my spine, as I think many people, other people have. Yeah, my question is really, why is, I can't even think, gametogenesis the answer? And it's a question about kinship, actually, I wanted to ask. So, and the role of the family in capitalist society. And, you know, in a way, this new technology of genesis, it appears as a potential liberating thing, particularly in relation to same-sex families. But why is that the answer when, and you know, why is it so important, do you think, for people to have genetic relationships with their children, and the extent to which this is liberating or actually reproducing of the capitalist system? So it's a question for both of you around the role of kinship. Thanks.
There's one more. There's one more there.
Hello, thank you both for really very interesting and extremely well put together presentations. First of all, I've got basically just one or two quick questions to ask Rebecca. First of all, I wonder just to some extent whether your argument is based on semantics, the life of capital and the life of human life. I mean, life of capital, it's really existence, but Marx talks a lot about capital being dead labor, and it's dead labor that is only brought to life because it consumes living labor. So there's just an issue of semantics there. That leads on to the emphasis that you give to non-capitalist interpersonal relations versus the social relations of capitalism in the workplace. And well, I could say some things about that, but I just think it's a bit problematic to talk about personal relations being non-capitalist in capitalist society. One of the possible results of posing it in the way that you do is that it means that struggles over social reproduction, struggles over reproductive rights particularly, become something that is separate from the class struggle, whereas I think the real task is to see the struggle for women's liberation and the struggle for women's control over fertility as very much an expression of class struggle, as very much part of it. And the last point is there really any such thing as a so-called demographic crisis and demographic time bomb? I mean, the problem would go away to some considerable degree if you had immigration, because there's plenty of workers. I mean, you said right at the end of your talk, the struggle for reproduction, you said at the end of your talk that accumulating surplus value requires more employees, which is contradicted by demography. Well, they can solve that problem just by opening up to immigration, but there's another way they can solve it. That is through,
to finish.
so on this very last sentence, imperialism allows them to suck surplus value out of living labor in the global south. They don't need to actually exploit workers here at home in order to make more and more and more surplus value.
Thank
So
you.
imperialism needs to be brought into the picture.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, the next person.
One, Matt. Thank you.
My question is for Professor Lucy. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Just a comment. Justin, the founder of Telegram, has announced that he has fathered more than 100 children.
Please, or you hold the mic closer.
Yeah, Yeah, I was just mentioning that the founder of Telegram has announced that he has fathered more than 100 children all around the world. So there seems to be this fascination of these like people in higher, hierarchy in the corporate to have this fascination with eugenics, reproducing, and all of that. In your presentation, I felt like you were indicating towards the misuse of this technology in the wrong hands, but you were kind of like, I was thinking you were trying to say, indicate to something, but you were just falling short of it, just giving an indication, right? So I want you to ask, like, what are the dangers of not the technology, but giving our fertility into the hands of the tech bros? I wonder how many of these like venture capitalists are women who are funding this technology, while the implications they are, it surrounds the women mostly. And so like what kind of like dystopian future for women do you think it can lead to, if at all? Thank you.
We have one last question here from Ingrid.
Thank you so much. Really, really interesting talks. I just have two questions for Lucy. I don't know if you work on this, but I know you work on the UK and the US, but I'm just wondering if you have some insights on like the global nature of the sector. Because I know a lot of people go abroad for IVF. So like what's the nature of like global competition for these patients? And also like what are the profit rates in these sectors? It would be interesting to know. And then also, since NHS also funds IVF, and I wonder if this, like the financialization of fertility and all these developments, also impacts that in any way. Yeah, can you say something about that? And then another question is about this genetic testing, because like from what I've been reading about it, like a lot of people argue that the way that NHS and other European countries as well, where it's banned, that there's like a sexist element to it. But I don't know if you what your position on that is, because although it's true that there can be like false negatives, if you do have a positive, your chances are so much higher, and especially like for people who are in their 40s. And the fact that like on the regulatory website it says, well, it doesn't increase your overall chances, because obviously if you have 5 embryos and you don't test, then you do 5 times and your chances are the same as if you test overall. But then that's not taking into account that the labor of actually doing those 5 rounds. So it's just like, oh, that's what women do anyway. So I don't know if you have like what your position on that kind of debate is. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. You have plenty of questions to answer. I'm just going to quickly add. Okay, all right, never mind. I'm going to hold back and I'm going to pass you.
Okay, I can start. Okay, the first question was around eugenics and the place of eugenics within all this, which is a really important question. And I appreciate your reference to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, because I think that's a key element to how I would answer the question when she talks about racism being like the logic of it being around the logic of death, whose lives get to be lived and whose don't, and to what extent. And hold it closer, please. Yes, sorry. And the place of eugenics within this is is both historical and political, in that capitalism and its drive for profit opportunistically feeds off legacies of imperialism and colonialism in order to exploit as much labor as possible while getting as much labor as possible free. So it reproduces racial hierarchies as a way to get free labor or underpaid, lower wages within the context, the configuration of social reproduction. And that is really I think the reactionary turn in social conservatism is very much tied to that, a renewed commitment to the Fordist family wage, because the Fordist family wage itself was a mechanism of wealth distribution that required required that it was a form of exclusion of the Fordist family wage for people of color, and the dependency of women of color as working domestically to uphold the Fordist family wage. And so this was although it's like retrospectively kind of seen also on the side of like socialists as well, see it as a kind of more a form of like broader wealth equality is structurally based on these legacies of eugenics, and the sort of commitment to that again is based on the political decision around wanting to keep these, intentionally wanting to keep these racial hierarchies in place. And that links, I think I would answer the question in a similar way. There was a question also around kinship, and I think the commitment to the Fortis family wage is embedded in that. And you've probably seen it already, but on that note, I look to the work of Melinda Cooper, and her book Family Values, I think, is really good on that question of the kinship relation in all of this. Did you want to answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of them were interesting.
The first one, maybe?
Oh,
Okay, yeah, okay, then I can kind of link it. So that's two questions. I had a question that was around where is dead labor and all this, like being a Marxist. And actually the title of the presentation was Vampires and Pensioners. And that was vampires is referring to the fact that the life of capital, which is abstract, is the life of the circulation of dead labor as appearing in, so I don't think that there is a disagreement there. You had a series of questions that I think are related around, all related to methodology. And one thing that I would start from, or where I would sort of approach to answering your questions from, is around my commitment to the dialectics internal to a Marxist methodology. And so when I'm saying something is a non-capitalist, it's always a dialectical category that's immanently and external. So it's always related to the labor movement. And so I think we're in agreement, but we're maybe where we were in a disagreement is that my commitment to these terms is dialectical. And so looking at those contradictions, and that contradiction is important because the element of being non-capitalist or trans-historical to capitalism entails that there's political possibility to apply social reproduction in such a way that we're reproducing social life that isn't a capitalist society. And so its otherness is politically essential. And I think I touched on most of the questions, not all of them, but maybe I'll look through my notes if you can turn it to you.
Great. Hello, great. So first, eugenics question from Angus, I think. Thank you. So, I mean, I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. So one cool thing, well, cool or it's terrifying, often overlapping in this field is orchid IVF. And I spoke with the CEO who did this, this one. So this is one thing that's different from what is available in the UK. In the UK, you can do PGTA, which is where you look for chromosomal euploid or non-euploid, basically the number of chromosomes. Also, if you're a carrier or you have a particular genetic disease that you don't want to pass on, there's a list of genetic markers that you can select for. Gender isn't included unless there's a medical indication. But in the US, you can select for gender, but you can also now do these whole genome reports, which can give you a much more detail about each of the embryo and how much information you might get about, you know, what kind of cancers they might get, what kind of birth defects and so on. So it's a very different approach to embryo selection that's now commercially available in the US. When it comes to racism, that's very much visible in the practice of egg donation. So I have a friend, Diane Tober, who just published the book Eggonomics, who has interviewed 200 egg donors, and it's got a lot of quantitative data as well. But it's got really great figures about how the compensation of egg donors is hugely different. So that there's like a ×5 difference in what white and Asian egg donors get paid versus Hispanic and Black egg donors, which is reflecting a demand in the market as well as racial preference. So that it's very obvious in that egg donation field as well as sperm donation. And then when we talk about the affordability of treatment, that links to the other question that was done. So I'm going to come back to the Trump question. But when it comes to gametogenesis, which the woman over there asked, so people do tend to value kinship, but of course that is culturally specific, historically specific, and so on. But I think this technology, if it became available, really addresses the main bottlenecks in IVF at the moment, which is mostly reproductive aging or unexplained infertility. And what you can do with in vitro gametogenesis is that you can do it at any time. There is a degree that you could do same-sex reproduction in case that was ethically permissible by countries. We'll have to see if that's the case. But really, it's much more also a question of eugenics, because you can scale up embryo production to a level that's unimaginable now. Like now, with a lot of effort, a lot of time and pain, you can get a handful of embryos. With this, you could create 10,000 embryos and then genetically analyze all of them and then pick one of them to implant. So it's a totally different game if that is how we're going to do it. Then about Trump becoming the father of fertility, a horrifying idea. But I think very much in line with other horrifying ideas that have existed throughout history. So if you look at many of the other populist nationalist leaders, think, for example, of Trump's example, Orban in Hungary. He has bought up a lot of IVF clinics for the state and has offered free IVF because he doesn't want, as the person in the back mentioned as well, he doesn't want migration. So he says and also the ADF has done that in Germany, has had campaigns say, we are going to make our own. We're not going to import people. We want to encourage you to make children yourself. So here's some free IVF to do that. And we see that also in the low birth rate countries like Japan and Korea offer a lot more IVF and egg freezing insurance for its citizens than other countries do. So it's part of that. Whether the lobbying happens, the lobbying has happened a lot in relation to avoiding the abortion restrictions affecting assisted reproduction. It will be interesting. I'm going to be at the largest reproductive medicine conference next week, and I will ask around about that. Investors are mostly men, but this is a relatively female sector. But it is it is on average many more men who invest. What kind of dystopian future we have? Well, I think what's particularly dystopian about the present already is that there's such an incongruence between what is being presented and what is actually happening behind the scenes. So we have a presentation of empowerment, of choice, of feeling like there are beautiful families just waiting if you enter into this transaction. Whereas a lot of the developments that I am sharing with you here are not known to the patients. These are not necessarily bad developments, but they are developments that shift the balance in power. And I think it's very important for citizens and for patients to be aware of that as they are navigating this field, as they are navigating these difficult choices that the woman in the front mentioned about PGTA. It's true, it's a very complicated debate. I didn't have a chance in terms of time to really go into the nuance of, the very different approaches to which patient groups PGTA, so the aneuploidy screening for embryos, may be helpful for, which ones they aren't. There's many different opinions among the professionals that I spoke to about whether it helps with miscarriage rates or whether it doesn't, whether we should look at overall birth rate or whether we should look at it on an embryo basis. And now the HFEA, so the regulator, has adjusted its recommendation that it is okay for certain groups, but not that recommended for other groups. But the bigger question that you're referring to is really about the role that the NHS plays in all these things is diminishing. So we see year on year the NHS cycles going down, local councils changing their policies so that there is now a postcode lottery. So whether you get IVF cycles or how many you get depends on where you live. We see people moving to get better deals or better provisions for that. So whether it is sexist to not have a PGTA because women have to endure more miscarriages, it is certainly an argument you can make. But we have to balance that argument with the reality in which we see that where there is more pressure of profit, we see these tests going up. And now there's also a class action suit about those false negative where intended parents say, my embryos were thrown away and maybe they could have worked out. So there is, what I find so fascinating about this field is that there's so many conflicting, painful discussions that are happening. There is not one feminist position. There isn't one progressive position. It's a constant negotiation. And the field you asked about profit rates has been characterized by high profit rates for few people. And now we see this move towards trying to scale up to have lower profit rates, but have more people go through the system and try and increase it in that way. So there was another thing I wanted to say, but I forgot what it was. But I'm generally really grateful for all these wonderful questions, and we hopefully can keep talking in the break.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. You can continue the conversation at lunch. Thanks all.
I was gonna say, I actually like extra. Hi.